How are you? You're muted. Why are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
I sure can.
Good, good. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad to see your beautiful face here. What's going on? How's the
Yes.
vivid?
He is doing wonderful. He's super sweet, as always. So he's doing great. Life is busy. I'm actually gonna have to leave like 10 minutes early because I'm
Yeah,
presenting for a NICASE's workshop, or webinar. So I have that.
good. Now I will
Um,
see you at SACES, correct?
Yes, I will be
Good.
there. I think I'm presenting twice. Going to do a presentation and a roundtable. So,
Good. I will go to them if there's no overlap.
yes.
That's exciting. Well, welcome, Erica, Emily, Suzanne. Appreciate y'all being here on Qual reporting standards. Give it another minute and then we'll start at the top of the hour since people are busy and, it's Friday. What I'm going to also do is I think I'm going to go ahead in the chat and I'm going to post some resources in here. So the first thing in there for those of you who still have UC logins or have UC logins, the first is the permalink for the JARS-Qual book. So um, if you're like me, if it's free, it's for me. So the library has the JARS-Qual book, and you are able to read it, download chapters of it online through UC's library. So there's that. And then I have some information just that I'm going to be going over, but I just wanted to put it in the chat so that you have it there. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. For those of you I do not know, I am Dr. Jana Bonfini. I am the director of the doctoral program here at the University of the Cumberlands, and I really have a passion for qualitative research. While I can do quantitative research, it isn't my favorite. Dr. Gibson is with us today. She is a 2023 UC grad who I was her methodologist. So she knows how I feel about qual. And she also knows that I'm a stickler for rules and all the other fun things too. So clearly it wasn't so bad because here she is today. So let's get started. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different format that we use for JARS-Qual. So I know several of you are doctoral students and you are writing dissertations. So this will be helpful for you. If you are also writing journal articles, Dr. Gibson, it will also be helpful for you to understand the format that's being used. So before there was a quant format, and for quantitative, it's very specific to the type of methodology you're using, right? Mancova is going to look different than path analysis, right? It's just going to be different. So sometimes people are like, okay, are there standards that are similar for qual? And so Heidi Levitt is the one who put together JARS-Qual and how to meet journal article reporting standards. So the American Psychological Association, for their journals, these are their standards for qualitative research. Counseling journals are turning over to JARS-Qual. In fact, at ACES, actually, I was sitting next to you, Dr. Gibson, when they were talking about the journal articles and to get published, they're like, hey, try to use this format because it'll make it super easy for us to recognize what you're doing, how you're doing it, and if you have all of the elements necessary for us to accept your publication. Right. So this is just a great way to streamline the information and make sure you have everything. We're going to look at all the different credibility factors, which are a little bit different. So I know in quant, we talk about validity and reliability. Well, we talk about trustworthiness in qual. So how do we represent that when we're writing up our dissertations, when we're writing up our journal articles? We'll talk about the different frameworks. And like I said, I posted the table in there, but we'll go over some of those elements in detail. And then we'll just talk about how to integrate this throughout your work, because I do think that this framework is very useful, not only if you're writing for publication or for dissertation, but it can be really helpful if you're taking research courses, how you're going to structure your paper. I know several people are probably taking the advanced quant class with Dr. Stretch or taking the advanced qual class now with Dr. Baggs, and you have to come up with proposals and other things like this. This can be really helpful to make sure that all the elements are there. So in terms of qualitative, some people are like, why do we need this? Well, once we have done our research, once we want to tell the story of our participants, we need to be able to find a fundamental way to communicate all of this new information, right? So our reporting standards are guidelines just to help us do that, right? And this is so we can really easily access and find the information that we need in your article. And yes, my lawn guy decided to blow leaves right outside of my window right as I got started. Isn't that awesome? He's great. Hi, stop. Okay. So there are different types of qualitative methods out there, and you might be more familiar with one or the other, right? So grounded theory, just a little review for those of you who might not have had a qualitative research class yet. And this is where we're going to generate theory from data that is systematically organized and analyzed. So you're collecting this data without any sort of preconceived theory, and then you're going to allow the patterns and concepts to emerge. And then from all of that, you're going to put it together into a theory. And so what you're doing with grounded theory is you're developing your own theory based on real world data. It's funny because I had a student the other day say, well, with grounded theory, what will my theoretical framework be? I'm like, no, that's what you're developing. Like, don't even worry. They're like, oh, so I can skip a section in my chapter 2? And I'm like, that's right. I was like, however, you're really going to feel it when you get to chapter 4. So you have to pick your hard. Phenomenology, a lot of you might be really familiar with phenomenology. And this is something that's very popular in our counseling profession, only because this is what we often do as counselors. We want to focus on understanding somebody's experience from their perspective, right? Our goal is to explore the essence or core meaning of experience related to a particular phenomenon. And we usually do this through in-depth interviews. Usually you'll do an initial interview, and then oftentimes you'll do a member check interview to make sure that you adequately covered all of the concepts and contexts that the participant has in mind. Case study, which Dr. Gibson did, involved an in-depth exploration of a single case or multiple cases. And this is a really useful methodology for understanding complex issues in a contextualized setting. So, for example, Dr. Gibson's work concerned the experiences of Black counselors and what happened when a client was committing some microaggressions against them. I still argue that some of them were not quite micro, but how that was for them, because no one teaches you that in school. Like, no one sat them down and said, hey, this might happen. Here's how to handle it. So oftentimes, how do they make sense of that? And then how does multiple people make sense of that experience? So narrative is a little bit different. This is where we're involving the collection and the analysis of stories and personal accounts. Narrative is a little bit different than some of the other types because oftentimes stories are co-constituted, right? There's a storyteller, and then there's a listener, and then there is the story that comes together after that, right? Because the story that you tell about your day might look a little bit different when you tell it to a spouse versus a friend versus a child versus a stranger on a subway, right? And so what we're trying to do with a narrative is we're focusing on how stories are structured and the meanings conveyed through them, often looking at individual life story or cultural narratives. And then ethnography, this is usually done more so in anthropology. And this is where people are immersing themselves in a particular cultural social group to observe the behaviors. My dissertation chairperson, Lisa Lopez-Levers, has done some ethnography where she's gone into parts of Africa where she's talked to indigenous healers and talked about mental health in their community, or she's worked with women who were survivors of the genocide in Rwanda and how they are recovering from that traumatic experience and how communities are coming together and what are the unique healing practices that they might have. You can't do that remotely, right? You need to go there and you need to immerse yourself. Not only do you need to immerse yourself, you have to build the credibility and the trust with the people that you're working with, and that it can't just be a quick fly-by-night, a quick touchstone, right? This is something where you are really immersed in that community so that you can get a true nuanced perspective of what is going on. And then last but not least, it says discourse analysis, but there's a lot that can fall underneath this, right? So this is where we're focusing on the analysis of written, spoken, sign language, symbols, all of that, and usually within a social context. So we might look at how language is used to construct meaning. We might look at identity. We might look at power dynamics, social realities. And so what you're doing here, you're looking at both the content and the structure of communication. So at my prior university, I used to teach a research class, and we would do content analysis, and I called it Content and Kanye, where we looked at Kanye West lyrics and sometimes videos to pull out themes related to power, related to society, related to race, gender, and all these different constructs. And then we would look at sort of the video, and we would watch it without the sound sometimes, so we can see the visual imagery. And then we would do it with the sound without any visual. So just the different layers of how does it look when we're looking at just the text? What does it sound like when you're hearing with the music over top of the lyrics? What does it look like when we're just watching it and observing? And oftentimes you can get 3 different messages from all of that, which is why I think sometimes people have different interpretations of art or artists, because they're all pulling from different aspects, right? And if you look at it within context, you might have a different perspective than if you're just looking at a lyric single-handedly. So that is discourse analysis. Usually our counseling students here at UC are focused on the first 4, grounded theory, phenomenology, case study, and narrative. However, even within those, there's variations. So for example, if you're doing phenomenology, interpretive phenomenological analysis is going to look very different from hermeneutic phenomenology. And that's going to look different from transcendental. Just like case study, the thinkers on that stake is going to look different from Merriam. Like they're just all very nuanced. And so we can have an understanding, a global understanding of which one you're using. But when we go to write up our articles, when we write up our dissertation chapters, we have to be very specific about alignment and to make sure that our questions and our collection measures and our analysis and our trustworthy measures, that they're all lined up with our particular approach. And so this JARS-Qual format can really help with that. So how do we start off in JARS-Qual? Well, like most things, right? We come up with our purpose. And I have yet to meet a dissertation student who doesn't have a very, visceral or passionate reason for their purpose behind their research, right? The purpose of the research project and the reporting of it is we're telling about our goals, like what are our goals personally as the researcher, but we're also saying, here's why it's important. And I'm grounding it in this particular context, in this particular time period, and here's why, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the purpose as sort of the overarching umbrella, right? Whether it's to explore a phenomenon, whether it's to provide a practical solution or a policy, or maybe it's to challenge existing knowledge. That's okay too. But the purpose affects every aspect of your study, from the methodology all the way to the reporting and discussion at the very, very end. So when we look at qualitative methods, the way that APA and in JARS-Qual, they sort of couch it as methodological integrity. So if we think about the concept of trustworthiness, that was proposed to communicate the value of quantitative research or qualitative research to help people discern, whether the claims made in the project are warranted. If I've worked with a student on qualitative research as a methodologist or a teacher or a chair, I always talk about Lincoln and Guba's 1985 article where they have the different measures of trustworthiness and credibility, transferability, conformability. So those things come up over and over again. But if we look at methodological integrity, this is where you are starting to think about trustworthiness and how it's operationalized. So this is really, the integrity is sort of the underlying base of trustworthiness. And so the way that they talk about it in terms of methods fidelity and methods utility. So if we think about fidelity, is it measuring what it says it's going to measure, right? Is everything aligned? So for example, I have an example here, like describing your methods and talking about how your perspective might influence your data collection. So I'll give you just a quick example. So I had a student once who was going to interview different school counselors about a particular problem that students were experiencing. If the student were to write up the results, but failed to mention that one of the schools he happened to intern at when he was a master's student, and the other school he currently works at as the counseling supervisor, right? That is some important information that needs to be talked about and needs to be mentioned, because if it's discovered later, it makes it look like the researcher, in my non-technical terms, is being shisty. But it's not ethical, and we're not really talking about how your perspective might be influencing your data collection, right? If you're interviewing somebody that you know well and you're fond of, right, that interview might go a different way than a perfect stranger that just happened to meet your criteria. So we just have to be very careful about that, and we have to basically have a good audit trail of what we're doing and how we're doing it, so that if somebody wants to say, okay, can I redo your study, you can say, here's how I did it. Right here are the plans. So utility, this is really like, how applicable is this study to what I'm doing, right? So I have this like little sort of if-then thing when I teach research methods to master student. I'm like, if a study has absolutely no utility, why are we doing it? Why are we wasting precious time, resources, energy when we could be doing something else? There's a lot of problems in the world. There's a lot of issues that we might need more answers to. Like, let's focus on something that can make a difference. And so this is sort of those evaluations that underlie trustworthiness, where we're not so much focused here with the utility on specific procedures per se, but it's more like, how do we make sure that we are getting out what we put in the whole way through, and that at the end of the day, we'll have something that is useful, that we know the context in which we can apply these results. So for example, I see this quite a bit. I used to see this quite a bit when I would be supervising new interns, and they would say something like, oh, I found this article and it seems really useful, this intervention for grief per se. And I'll say, that is really useful. But if we want to make sure that, we can use it with our folks, who was it normed on? And they're like, oh, well, and then they look and they're like, well, it looks like it was normed on sort of the weird population, that white, educated, affluent, da, 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 da. And so college student. And I was like, well, you're working with a LGBT grief group. So I'm not quite sure that this is going to align, even though this research looks really interesting. I think more work needs to be done before we move it from research to practice, right? Seems useful, but we need to make sure that we're adhering to principles of good research and making sure that its trustworthiness, the transferability is really applicable, and that we're not doing harm or causing harm to clients. So just ways that we can check methodological integrity, things like transcripts and data collection for participants for feedback. I think almost every qualitative researcher that does their work at UC, they all do this at least. Oftentimes they'll go and do member checks. They will send them the transcript and they'll say, hey, I'd like to follow up with you about this. Would you like to add any context? Would you like to have any additions? Is there something that needs to be rephrased differently? And I will say almost every single student who has done that, they find even richer information that they didn't expect to find on that member check. So that first interview, they are answering all of those interview protocol questions that were carefully designed to answer the research questions and beautifully aligned with their methods. But that member check, when they can say, this is how this was for me to do this research, this is what came up, this is what I think you also need to know, here's some additional information, that's magic. And that's, more things that you can include in your study that contribute to the methodological integrity. Another thing is that we're going to always have thick and rich descriptions. I know it sounds like we're talking about a pudding or a mousse, chocolate mousse, but we really want to make sure that we have a robust explication of what is going on and what the person was thinking, what they said, and really keep track of that. Another thing is sometimes you'll do triangulation. right? Just to make sure that the same information is being found cross-case or cross-participant. So we do a lot of cross-case, cross-participant comparisons too, just to make sure that we're hitting the themes that we need to hit, and also to make sure that we have saturation in the first place, right? We want to make sure we don't have a certain N to achieve in qualitative research like they do in quant. We're not running G-Power for qualitative research, but we do want to make sure that we do have data saturation. And sometimes you might think you do, and then you read through your transcripts and you're like, not yet. You're doing the analysis, you might be close, but you might have to continue with your recruitment. Another thing is to do reflexivity. So having a journal, having a diary, field notes, memos. And I had a student recently, and I'll show you sort of a sample sort of field journal or reflexivity journal, who ended up including it into her dissertation. And she wanted people to know that, like, even though these were the results that she got, here are some things that she thought about in the course of the interview process. And as a researcher, we try to check some of our preconceived notions and biases and all of that. But, a couple of her participants, I'm just going to say it how it was, really annoyed her. And she felt like they were either humble bragging or they were doing too much, so to speak. And so she was like, something came up for her as she was collecting that data, and she just wanted to think about why that was, right? So that it didn't color her analysis. So I thought that was a really important step to make sure that, again, we're human, we're not robots. We have feelings about feelings sometimes. And so we need to make sure that we are being extremely accurate with what's being said and how it's being said. So how do we situate our research? Now, sometimes we think about things like titles and abstracts and keywords, and it's like, it's just something that I do, right? It's just something that you throw on there. Okay, you can be creative. You can absolutely be creative. In fact, I encourage you to be creative. Maybe professional, but also be creative. One of my dissertation students who graduated last year, her title of hers was Blame It on the Pigment. It was the lived experiences of Black men in the school to prison pipeline, right? Is that not a catchy title? It's still talking about what she was looking at, but she was also putting a spin on it. So it's like, okay, this is going to be interesting. You're going to want to keep reading. And so I really encourage people to think about how they are crafting that part of it. I always call it the advertisement, because sometimes when people are searching articles, they're looking at keywords. So making sure your keywords are accurate, but also they're skimming through that abstract. They're like, what's your methodology? How many people? What's keyword? Is it interesting? Who are your participants? And if it seems interesting, they'll keep reading. If it doesn't, they'll be like, nope, I can't tell you how many abstracts that I read when I was crafting my own dissertation. It's probably like a 10-to-1 versus those that I read and included versus like those that I did not. So like for every one, at least 10, if not 20 or 30, you just card because the abstract doesn't seem like it's going to get you much of anything. And for some people, like maybe you're doing something brand new or something hot. And so there might not be a lot of research on that in the first place. So maybe you have to go and think about how you're going to frame the question so that you can fill those gaps, so that you can try to touch on those pieces. So it's really important that when you're creating that abstract, that you're hitting the essential elements and that those keywords are really good. Not something that is so sort of esoteric. Like you can be a little basic with your keywords, right? If you're looking at generational trauma, go ahead and put trauma and then put generational trauma. So that way, if somebody is like using those keywords and quotes, that you'll pick up on both, right? Go ahead and do qualitative research. I know some of you want to be like, I'm doing transcendental phenomenology. Yeah, great. But do qualitative and then just do phenomenology, right? Like, let's get some eyeballs on your abstracts, because who knows, somebody could be inspired by how you're writing up your abstract. I know it just sounds so simple. It's just an abstract, right? But it's not, because this is really the first exposure people have oftentimes to your work. So you want to make sure it's good. All right, your introduction. This needs to be engaging too, right? We never want to start with since the dawn of time or a Webster's, dictionary definition, I like anecdotes, especially for qualitative. I like stories. I like origin stories, like how things came to be. But what the introduction does, it really situates the research in the existing literature. It explains the significance of your research question. And it's a really great way to make a strong impression and to encourage them to keep reading, right? They've already opened it up. They've already started to look at it, right? They had to go through a database to find your paper. And so they start to read it. And if that introduction is compelling, they're going to keep scrolling, keep reading, right? So a strong introduction, what you're doing there, you are reviewing theoretical writing and empirical studies related to your topic itself, but you're also highlighting common themes that are in the literature. It is not some comprehensive literature review because usually there are some pretty significant page counts on literature review sections for journal articles or just journal articles in general. One of my students is condensing her dissertation right now from about 300 plus pages to a max of 31-page journal article. And that includes references. So the struggle is real because it's like, I think it's all important. And then I reviewed it. She's like, I got it down to like 34. And then I cut her literature review, like a swashbuckler. Like, I think I eliminated 90% of it. And she's like, you just cut all the literature. I'm like, yes, because all we want is a succinct, these are the themes in the literature. We're moving on, right? So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to describe the problem and you're trying to situate it in the research before people move on to your research questions and to see really what was under examination and how are you framing your research. So research questions. Oop, I have a little example thing and it's not popping up. It was going to be so pretty. Right? So if we're looking at elements of your research questions, first of all, they need to be aligned with what your participants are responding to, right? So for example, if I am looking at a narrative of how stay-at-home moms think about that as a label and how that affects their identity and their self-perception, right? Then I'm going to ask something like that. Maybe I'm going to ask them also about a term like non-working parent, because some people use that interchangeably with stay-at-home parent, which, I mean, I don't know a single parent that doesn't work, but that's, that's me. Right. And so maybe I'm going to ask them how they feel about it, what contributes to their sense of identity. Tell me about the work that they do. So maybe my questions are related to that. And we have to be very clear. So we don't want to muddied central question. And if we need additional nuance, sometimes the questions can be really helpful for that. So another example is, if I'm doing a phenomenological study, I might say, what are the lived experiences of midlife individuals who have considered suicide? Right. And that study was a hermeneutic phenomenological study. So I'm asking for the lived experiences of somebody at a specific stage of life who have had suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, and what's going on for them. And so maybe a sub question for that would be, how do people in their lives perceive their symptoms and their struggles? Right. So talking about the interpersonal piece. So things like that. So we just have to be very clear about our research questions and to make sure that they're completely aligned with our methods and that we're not trying to mix traditions, so to speak. All right, your methods section. This is the fun part. So the key components here is where we're really trying to provide that rationale for design. We've done that before. And now we're saying, here's how we're going to do this, right? We're going to clearly describe your design, your selection, your criteria, your collection, and your analysis. So it's like, really, what did you set out to do? And how and why did you set out to follow that course of action? You want them to understand exactly what you did and then believe that the method you chose has led to findings that they can trust, right? So to increase people's confidence in what you're doing, first, you have to be very transparent. You have to provide a rationale for your decision. So for example, if I'm doing a study and I interviewed 12 women and I did all my member checks, and one of the women called later and said, you know what, I really I'm really afraid that I will be identified. I know that you've given me these assurances. I know that we're using pseudonyms. I know we're using regions of the country and not states, but I'm still really concerned because I know the story, this research is about interpersonal partner violence. And I really don't want to be in the study anymore. Okay. And so when I do my write-up, I'm not going to say I interviewed 11 people because I didn't. I interviewed maybe 12, right? And so I would say of the 12, 12 women were identified and interviewed or whatnot. And I would say one withdrew from the study. So then 11 participants. So I would be very clear about what happened, right? Sometimes, and I've had this with doc students, sometimes they will interview somebody and they think it's going to go well. And the interview either is really short, or the person's distracted, or they get interrupted, or they have their own agenda. This is sometimes true when people are interviewing people who have similar experience. So whether it's another clinician or another faculty member or something like that, they have a very different opinion of what should be talked about. And so the interview can kind of go off the rails. I always say include it if you can, but if we're not getting much useful information from it, or if the answers seem pretty off base, you can exclude it, but you have to explain why, right? You can't just be like, well, forget that. I'm just going to delete that case. We wouldn't accept that in quantitative research. We can't accept it here for qual either. And so another thing you're going to do is you're going to be very clear about your data analysis methods. So for example, I think most people understand that when you're doing interviewing, that's your data collection, right? You are usually recording and transcribing, you're sending the transcript back, you're doing your member check, and then what, right? And I've heard students go, well, I'm going to theme and code. And I'm like, according to what? According to what thinker, theory, analytic plan, like what is the sort of technology, so to speak, behind it to keep track of all of that? And so what is your approach to data analysis? Are you using like an inductive thematic analysis format? Are you using maybe Max Van Manen's hermeneutical process of analysis? Are you using Smith, Flowers, and Larkin's IPA process? Like, we need to be very clear about what process you're using, because we're going to expect to see that in your write-up. So how do we recruit? We're going to have to talk in our sections about how we did our recruitment. Are you doing this face-to-face? Are you doing it electronically? Are you doing this via email? What kind of sampling are you doing? Are you doing snowball? Are you doing convenience? Like, we need to be very clear. How many people did you need, right? There are some phenomenon that it might be really difficult to do recruitment. So if you get 4 or 5 people and you reach saturation, you're cooking with gas. And then there's other things where you're like, 4 or 5 people, keep going. You need to triple that at least before we're there. We need to talk about the rationale or the decision for saturation. How did you reach saturation? How did you know you reached saturation, right? Because sometimes people go, oh, I'm going to get 8 to 10 participants. They get their 8, and I'll read their write-up for chapter 4. I'll see their analysis, and they'll be like, I got my 8. And I'm like, but you don't have saturation. Like, you mean I have to keep going? Yes, absolutely, right? Because how do you explain it otherwise in this section, right? And so we need to make sure that we are being extremely clear about how we reached people. And if for some reason there is a pre-existing relationship, maybe you are soliciting from a residential treatment facility where you used to be a clinical supervisor, right? You don't work there anymore. But it's still important that you explain that this is why you use that site and how you use that site, in what ways. So those kinds of things. If you're going to compensate in some way, whether you're going to provide participants with an Amazon gift card, whether you're going to offer them a book or some other small token as a thank you for participating, we need to make sure that that's explained. For those of you who are thinking about adding some sort of incentive or compensation, you just have to be very careful that you don't over incentivize, because then you can have some folks, like one of my students did, who were super quick to respond to surveys and want to be interviewed because they were super excited about that big old Amazon gift card that was guaranteed if they participated. And they didn't meet the criteria, but they said that they did. It was a mess. It was like adventures in recruitment. So you just have to be very clear and very careful about how we are describing this process. Here's an example from Boleg et al. In 2015, just of what it looked like for this describing of the recruitment process. And so I know it's a little bit small if you're reading it on screen. Participants were recruited from randomly selected venues, barbershops, street corners in Philly, based on US Census block with a Black population of at least 50%. Two male trained recruiters approached Black men who appeared to be at least 18 years old and provided them with the study's recruitment postcard. So this is a face-to-face invitation. The postcard invited them to participate in a confidential study about health and sexual experiences of Black men. Prospective participants were screened by phone to determine whether they met the study's eligibility criteria of identifying as Black or African American, heterosexual, being between the ages of 18 and 44, having vaginal sex in the last 2 months. And then after they complete a brief self-administered demographic survey, they received a $50 cash incentive to participate. And so this was done out of Drexel University, that's also in Philly, and that's how they did their study. So just a quick, this is how I did it. This is what we offered. Here's why. Here's the inclusion. And so that makes sense for this study that is talking about Black heterosexual men's discursive constructions of safe sex and masculinity. This is a pretty, clear, and just really lays out every single element that we just described in recruitment and why. And so it does make sense in terms of this study's selection. So just, it doesn't have to be, 8 paragraphs in your short article. It can just be 2, but we have to just be very tight with how we include all of that information in those 2 paragraphs. Okay, so collection. We have to talk about the form of data collected. Are you doing questionnaires and surveys? Is it media? Is it observation? Are they interviews? Sometimes it can be multiple pieces. I had a student who 2 years ago, she did a narrative study on the experience of secondary traumatic stress in teachers returning to teach after the pandemic. And so what she did first, in order to nuance whether they had secondary traumatic stress, she surveyed a couple hundred teachers on the burnout inventory. And for those who, not just that, she did that and she did the pro-qual. So she did those 2 inventories. And so those who sort of had high levels of emotional exhaustion and had the secondary traumatic stress in the pro-qual, they were invited to participate in the interviews. So she went from a couple hundred to, I want to say it was 50. And then she did a preliminary interview with 30. And then she had 12 complete sort of this full interview. So there were multiple pieces there. There was each of those instruments not used to, so use it as a criteria, but also used to inform, right? To say, hey, this was your score on these instruments. What do you think about that? Why do you think that might be? What's going on? And for most of the teachers, there were some concerns about themselves and their own families, but a lot of them are really concerned about the kids that they teach. They're like, some of the kids didn't return to school. We don't know where they are. I haven't heard from them since March of 2020. And I'm scared. And I love that kid. And they had a good family and I can't get in touch with them. I've driven by houses. They're not there. I don't know where they are. I've Googled, I can't find them. Right? So just fear, sadness, frustration, right? All of these things are contributing to their feelings of secondary traumatic stress after a global pandemic, while oftentimes administrators are asking them to do more with less, right? So there were all these different pieces of data she was collecting. What you're going to do is you're going to talk about any sort of alterations in data collection strategy that might have altered the study's rationale. So maybe you were asking a certain protocol of questions and you're like, these questions aren't doing it. So you pause collection and you pivot and you file another IRB application or an amendment to your original application. And so you need to talk about the pivot and why. You need to talk about how long you were engaged with these people. Was it I interviewed them for an hour? I sent them their member check. We did a follow-up for 15 minutes, bada bang. Or is it like the student I was mentioning who did the survey first? and then did an initial demographic, and then did an initial interview, and then it did a more comprehensive interview, right? So for her, she was engaged with these participants from the time those first emails went out to the time she finished, and she did a little summary of results that she sent to all of her participants. It was well over a year. So that's an extended engagement piece of it, to the point where, she used numbers to describe her participants. But if I were to read a quote off of her extensive chapter 4, she would know exactly who said it and what they looked like when they said it, because she was so engaged in that data collection process. So you want to talk about in that how you were able to, using audio to make sure that you secured your transcripts, that you secured your video so that no one can hack your computer and get somebody's personal information that maybe they were, you were the first one that they told that phenomenon or that story to. So we want to make sure all of these are in that section. So this section is one of my favorites. So this is what we're using and why are we using this? What are we doing? How are we doing this? How are we identifying what categories were formed, right? Are you using a priori codes, based on the theory that you came in with? Or are you doing only in vivo codes that come up as you're doing your data analysis, right? Or you're reading through your codes. How are you doing it? Is it a mix of both? If so, why? Talk about why. What are the units of analysis? Are you looking at individual interviews within different questions? Are you looking questions across everybody? Are you looking how are you divvying up this data analysis process? Because as Ginevra can tell you, and other people can tell you who have done qualitative research, you're going through hundreds and hundreds of pages of really pertinent information. And you're like, it's all important. Yes, but how do we make sense of it? How are we making sense of it? And if you make certain choices, you could end up with different results. So we have to have a really clear rationale and description of why we're doing this. Some students like to use software, whether that's Excel, whether it's in vivo. My personal favorite is Atlas TI. So if you're using it, how are you using it? Why are you using it? What was that? What did you get from that? I like it just as a way to keep all that data organized. However, students can do Excel. Students can keep it organized in a spreadsheet. That's okay. And then I have another student who printed them out. She got a bunch of highlighters and she highlighted, and that worked for her. So what's the process? Let us know. How did you do your analysis? Ethical considerations, we always want to make sure that we are talking about any potential ethical considerations that pop up, whether that's with recruitment, whether that's with making sure that our participants have full informed consent, making sure that they know that at any given time they can pull out of the study. No questions asked, making sure that we are being truthful and accurate, making sure that we're not causing any harm in the way that we're doing our interviews. All of those good things that we do as counselors, we need to do as researchers too. Okay. And then safeguarding and being transparent to let your participants know precisely what you're studying and why. Most of us, when we do our informed consent, it's like, this is the purpose of this study. This is what I'm trying to find out. I think it's really important that we are clear, because we're asking people to spend their time and to tell their stories and to talk about their experience. Some of the experiences can be really hard to talk about, can be really sensitive. So we want to make sure that we keep their identity private, that we don't give informations or quotes where someone could easily figure them out. Right. For a lot of things, maybe you would never be able to figure them out. But things like if I'm interviewing BIPOC counseling faculty who teach assessment and research methods at K-CREP accredited institutions, there's only so many of them, right? And it's not outside of the realm of possibility that someone could read something like, ooh, I think I know who that is, right? And so you want to make sure that if the population is very small and they might have a public facing role, that you are very careful about attributing a quote to one person or another. You might want to do sort of an aggregate of a theme or a quote. I had a student who recently in her dissertation, she was looking at a particular school district And because they kind of all knew each other and they knew who was in it, she didn't report her demos one at a time. She did sort of averages and aggregates in that. And I loved that because otherwise it might have been very easy to identify who was who. So, all right, results section. Okay, this is fun. This is where you get to share your findings that you worked so hard to generate, right? This is what's up. This is where it is a pleasure to read when it's well written, right? You want to make sure that you have excerpts and notes and quotes and maybe an illustration of your find. Like you want to wow us with your amazing data. Levitt, in the qualitative JARS book that she has, that they published in 2022, she has a template. She has a template, and she did it this way so that the results can bring to life all the communications and interviews and stories and resonate with your readers as well. I also think because the findings are so contextualized to the participants' characteristic and interpersonal dynamics, like if you write it in a particular way, they are transferable to other clinicians, to educators, to advocates, to researchers. So we really want to bring life to this section. We don't want it to be a dull, boring, just explication. Here it is. We really want to color this with life and make sure that we are accurately describing people's experiences. So here's, I have a little mini screenshot of Levitt's of her template. And so she's basically like, this initial orientation is just like, here's an overview of the findings. And then the next one, she has her main finding, and she does it logically. So main finding 1, main finding 2, for something like maybe a phenomenological study, maybe you're doing this in order of themes, right? Here's what came up. And then maybe you'll use a quote, right? Dr. Sue Haddad, who teaches in our program, who was also a graduate of our program, she did a hermeneutic phenomenological analysis, and it was about burnout and college counselors. And one of the quotes that is just so memorable, I think we used it for one of her titles, and it was like, burnout's like wildfire. It spreads and just reduces everything before you even know it. And so, that is a really like, oh, yeah, that does happen. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on prevention, right? Because burnout isn't an if for most of us, it's a when. It's the nature of doing the work that we all do. So how do we prevent it? How do we work through it? And how do we make sure that people know that it's a systemic thing, that burnout just doesn't occur in individuals? It is something that we in systems and in communities need to solve for ourselves. So for each of the findings, you will go through it. So she has a template in that permalink that I sent, and it's excellent. I highly recommend using it as a guide for that. The discussion section, this is where we're talking about the contributions that are made from these findings. We're looking at similarities and differences from prior. So for those of you who are writing in your dissertations, typically we're looking at that piece of it, the identify and the reflect on. Usually we're doing that in chapter 5, right? Here's my interpretation based on my data, and here's how it relates back to this prior literature. And then you're going to reflect on any sort of alternative explanations. Could it have been something different? Could it be, are there other explanations for this? Is there something else that can be done? Like you can even, I'll get to this in a little bit, you can even talk about, in the future, if I did this study, I would look at X. Or maybe I'm going to revisit this topic with these participants if they're willing and able in 5 years, and to see if this still holds true. Longitudinal studies are wonderful. Highly recommend. And then this is just a sample field or reflexive journal. So maybe in terms of your participant, what are they saying? How would you describe it? And how are you reflecting on that? What's coming up for you as a person, right? Again, you're not a robot. You're going to have some feelings about it. Were you excited and energized? One of my students recently did an interview, and it basically was like, almost like the perfect interview, as she called it. It was like everything that I had ever wanted to find out. It was like, I could not have scripted it better, and just felt really energized, but also like, I am ready to advocate. I am ready to like write these results up because I really want to make a change for this population. So I really think that, having a reflexive journal could be really helpful. Yes, Nina, I will make the PowerPoint available. Yep, we're going to post it online along with the link to the video. So that will be available to you. And if you want the PowerPoint, like the Reflexoderm or anything like that, I have it. So just send me an email and I will send it to you. And then any other information, you're going to look at your strengths and limitations, right? I would love to say that all of our research is just so strong, we have no limitations. But, the nature of research is that there's always some things that you chose to leave out or not examine. Being qualitative research, we do tend to look at smaller populations because we're trying to make sure that the phenomenon is a shared experience throughout your participants. How does your process and your choices, how does that strengthen or weaken the research itself? Talk about the scope of transferability, right? We can't say, oh, now that I have explored how this works, we're going to apply it to everybody and anybody. No, you can't make that claim. But who can you try to transfer it to? What else might you need to know? Any sort of ethical dilemmas that popped up along the way? And then looking at those future implications. So, any sort of future study that you want to do, any practical applications or policy suggestions. So for example, if somebody is looking at burnout, for example, maybe letting counselors in training develop a self-care plan early in their program, and then throughout their program of study, having them continuously develop it, having them add to it as they learn more about who they are as a clinician, who they are about a human, how they react to certain stressors, and then also letting them know that there are systemic pieces to having burnout, such as a very heavy caseload, having high numbers of clients with really strong needs, or having no supervision, or having, cash flow issues and requiring you to have maybe a second job, right? Those things can all go into it. And so policy suggestions should be practical and they should be made based on the findings itself, right? And then conclusions, just a quick summary of the main findings, a call to action. Sometimes it's, hey, everybody, I would really like for more people to look at this with different populations, or I would really like to have additional research along this context, or maybe I will repeat this research, in 5 years to see if the results are sustaining, or if this was just a blip in time because this particular issue, whatever it is really hot and popular right now. And lastly, what do you want your reader to remember when they read your amazing research? What do you want them to walk away from? What are those impressions, right? And I know I talked about impressions in terms of the title, in terms of the introduction, and it's like, okay, that seems like kind of frou-frou and stylish, but that's kind of the thing that people remember. They remember things that are catchy. They remember things that draw you in. And so there's a conclusion that Levitt puts in her book, and I love this. She puts this ending their study about feminist multicultural supervision. And the quote is, the future of FMS may bear supervisory contexts that empower clients, trainees, and supervisors to realize a vision of applied psychology that embodies respect for cultural difference and unflinchingly seeks to balance the scales of power in society writ large. It's like, ooh. And it's a beautiful one little sentence to tie a whole bow on everything at the very end. And it's very well done and well written. So that's all I got for now. The references are there. I am happy to take any questions if you have them. And if not, I look forward to seeing you at a future JARS or other scholarly engagement presentation. And if you are here at UC, feel free to send me an email if you want some of the slides or anything else. So I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Or yeah, it is evening. I guess it's afternoon for most places, maybe if you're not on the West Coast. And I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Buffini. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Have a good one.